Hello to all viewers and listeners. I am JP Hague, and this is a conversation with the one and only George Knapp. George, I'm going to just briefly introduce you to the viewers and listeners here in the Indian Ocean, for those that don't know who you are, although many people will obviously know who you are because you're huge. I just want to say that George was born in Woodbury in New Jersey. He grew up in Northern California and graduated from Franklin High School in Stockton, where George was a senior class president. George earned a bachelor's degree in communications from the University of West Georgia and a master's degree in the same field from the University of the Pacific. He taught debate and forensics at both the University of the Pacific and University of California in Berkeley. He moved to Las Vegas in the early 1980s and was hired as an intern and then as a news reporter, and was later hired as a reporter and news anchor for KLAS. George became known nationally in the late 1980s by reporting the story of Bob Lazar, who claimed to have worked on extraterrestrial craft at the secretive area known as Area 51. In 1990, George's stories on Lazar earned him an individual achievement by a journalist award from the United Press International. In the late 90s and early 2000s, George worked with the now defunct group, National Institute of Discovery Sciences, or NIDS. And NIDS was founded in Las Vegas by businessman and aerospace visionary and developer Robert Bigelow. NIDS was charged with scientifically studying unusual phenomena with scientists and funding. And based on this work with NIDS and biochemist Colm Kelleher, George gave the public awareness of the so-called Skinwalker Ranch in northeast Utah, where paranormal events have been meticulously studied and recorded. George first published a book, The Hunt for Skinwalker, Science Confronts the Unexplained, at a remote ranch in Utah in 2005. And George has since become an internationally renowned TV investigative journalist, news anchor, and talk show host, and has been recognized with Edward R. Murrow Awards, Peabody Awards, and dozens of Pacific Southeast Regional Emmy Awards for his work. George is now a well-known and established figure and fixture in Las Vegas media, and remains at KLAS TV. He is also a regular host of the Sunday night or Monday morning Coast to Coast AM radio show. George is particularly known for his work investigating UFO reports, which are a frequent topic on the Coast to Coast show, Mystery Wire channel, and KLAS TV, across which George kindly interviewed me last year. But today it is my turn to ask the questions in this conversation on George's most recent co-authored book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, an insider account of the secret government UFO program, which goes deep into government-funded research at Skinwalker Ranch, phenomena further afield, and how it all connects to the machinery of government and the military. On that note, let me welcome you, George, and thanks so much for joining me in conversation and for this exploration.
Great to talk to you again, Jonathan. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's really nice to see you again, George. It's been about a year and a half since we last spoke. We covered quite a lot of things on what's happening in Mauritius, but I'm fascinated by what I read in your latest book, because I think it gets into the nitty-gritty of the phenomena beyond the nuts and bolts of what is reported and believed to be UAP or unidentified aerial phenomena. I'm just going to briefly give a kind of background information to our viewers and listeners on the chronology of how we got there. Basically, in 2007, 3 bipartisan senators in the US Senate lobbied the leadership of the Senate Appropriations Defense Subcommittee for about $22 million. And this was approved by Senators Harry Reid, appropriately of Nevada, home of Area 51, the then US Senate Majority Leader, and 2 senators from the Appropriations Committee named Senators Inouye of Hawaii and Stevens of Alaska. And this was the first government-funded study of UAP since the closure of the US Air Force's Project Blue Book in 1969. The Senate proposal was addressed to the Defense Warning Office, or DWO, at the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, and the remit of this project was to cover UAP and any other paranormal phenomena associated with it. And between September of 2008 and December 2010, the DIA's Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Applications Program, or AAWSAP, essentially delegated research and field studies to Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, or BASS. So this is basically known as AAWSAP-BASS, and it was unique in that it scientifically studied material and objective observations alongside the more mental and subjective or consciousness side of UAP research. So it was much, much broader than ATIP, which was, I think, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which came a bit later and got confused in a December 2017 New York Times press article for AAWSAP-BASS, which is what we're here to talk about this evening. So the BASS side of things was set up by Robert T. Bigelow, and he did this as a sister company to his fairly well-known Bigelow Aerospace. And this was the only contractor to put in a bid and who, was given the project under the DIA or AAWSAP. And the core figures to the program, as I know, were Drs. James T. Lakatsky, who was the DIA program manager and contracting officer and representative. And he was, or is, basically a DIA ballistic missile physicist. And he worked alongside Colm Kelleher, who was the project manager of the AAWSAP and BASS side of the program in Las Vegas. And he has a biotech background. And he basically oversaw the day-to-day operations of the program. The book is co-written with George, who was intimately involved in the NIDS program, as mentioned, between 96 and 2004, and in other investigations that were ongoing, I think, since the late 80s. So, George, you're very knowledgeable about this program. One other thing I just wanted to mention to the listeners is that in the introduction to the book, we learned that AAWSAP's first case was actually the now famous USS Nimitz tic-tac event from November to December 2004. And this was thanks to the AAWSAP-BASS program that's covered in the book. And this was thanks to, I believe, the second recruit of the program, Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Kurth, which was an amazing introduction into this formidable case that everybody now knows about. So without further ado, I think at this stage, it's good just to go back to basics. And if we look at the title of the book, which has, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, I just would like you to explain to the listeners and viewers, what is a Skinwalker? And can you give us a flavor of the unique background to Skinwalker Ranch, where much of the book is set?
In Native American lore, a skinwalker is a shapeshifter, often an evil sorcerer who, in order to obtain the abilities of a skinwalker, has to commit a terrible crime. And within the Navajo, the crime is that they have to murder someone in their family. And after they accomplish that, they have the ability to change their shapes, change from a human into a wolf, into a coyote, into a bird, and to pursue their nefarious intentions. I know we look at that sort of as a quaint Native American superstition, but that belief extends through all of the tribes of the American Southwest and through most tribal lore across North America, one version or another. The Skinwalker story, as it relates to the ranch and to UFOs, stems from the 1994. A ranch family moves onto this property in northeastern Utah, 480 acres, pristine, beautiful, southwestern U.S., a little bit of a stark environment, but really beautiful, well-watered. It was their dream home. And in 1994, as soon as they moved in, really strange things started happening that we can go into in a bit. It persisted for almost 2 years until Robert Bigelow came in, bought the property, installed his team of NIDS investigators, and set to work to try to figure it out. The word Skinwalker, I first heard it in 2001, during one of my first visits to the property. And there was a historian there named Junior Hicks. He'd been a science teacher in the Uintah Basin for his entire life, and he became the unofficial custodian of UFO cases and records for that area. And it had been a hotspot for UFO activity as long as humans had lived there. As far back as the late 1700s, when the first Europeans came through there, they reported what would amount to UFOs flitting around over their campfires. The early Mormon settlers all had their own stories. The Native Americans, when the Utes were forced into that area by President Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s, they started reporting these things as well. It goes back as far as humans have been there, across all cultural boundaries. People have been seeing the strange things in the sky. That's what attracted the attention of Robert Bigelow to the ranch property. He had heard there's UFOs there, had no idea how much more involved and more intricate the stories were. So the first time I heard it, as I said, was in 2001 when I encountered Junior Hicks. And I'm looking at this beautiful sandstone ridge that abuts the northern edge of the property. And he says, yeah, that's the path of the Skinwalker. And I go, what? Skinwalker? Kind of raised the hair on my arm. I didn't know what it was. I'd never heard the term. And he explained it to me that the Native Americans who had lived there for 100 and so years did not set foot on that property. It wasn't absolutely forbidden, but they advised their members not to go there because of an evil presence that was there. The Skinwalker was their umbrella term to explain all the strange things they had seen in the property. They thought it was the result of a curse that the Navajo tribe, with which the Ute tribe had battled for so many years, decades, had put a curse on them, and then that was a Skinwalker that lived there. And so I thought, oh, that's kind of an interesting idea for a title as an explanation for all the weird stuff that goes on there. And we wrote that book, Hunt for the Skinwalker. We never thought we were literally hunting for a Skinwalker, but maybe we were after all. So we write that book in 2005. It comes out, and it came to the attention of a lot of intelligence officials in D.C., including Dr. James Lukatsky at the DIA. He had read the book, passed it around to some other people who later worked on the program that we're going to discuss. They thought there were interesting national security implications, that perhaps there is a technology that represents a threat. I mean, as we'll get into, there were holes in the sky, craft coming in and out, unidentified craft of many shapes and sizes seen by not only the ranching family, but all their neighbors and all their neighbors' neighbors throughout the whole Uintah Basin. So maybe I'm jumping ahead of us here, but Dr. Lukatsky passed that around information to friends of his in the intelligence community, and eventually asked for a chance to go to the ranch and see it for himself. I know I skipped a lot of stuff there in sort of glossing over.
No, I think that was an excellent overview of what's going on, and it isn't, so excuse the pun, pie in the sky. This has a scientific and objective basis in reality. So much so that we're now waiting for the president's signature heralding the 61st update to the Defense Authorization Act, which is momentous and significant because it has provisions on UAP or UFOs. And
the Skinwalker story plays a direct role in what happened there. So
exactly. And I think my question for you, George, is, given the input that AAWSAP-BASS had at Skinwalker Ranch and elsewhere, do you see any wider scope for the data gathered historically under AAWSAP-BASS to be used for congressional release and briefings by the Congressional UAP office, which is set, I think, for the end of October 22? Or are you even aware of any plans to revive a similar program under the Pentagon or the DoD?
Well, it seems like the legislation as written with this amendment that was included by the senator from New York almost duplicates what the intention of AAWSAP was. I think to the chagrin of people who'd like it to just be limited to UFOs, nuts and bolts UFO craft. It's hard enough to get the military to agree that this is worthy of study and that the public needs to be kept in the loop and informed of what's going on. They've fought that tooth and nail forever. As you mentioned, Blue Book was the last acknowledged UFO program. It closed down in 1969, and the Air Force announced, that's it, we're done. There's no national security implications whatsoever, no proof that UFOs are a threat. We're not going to study it anymore. Well, we know that those programs at one level or another continued beyond Blue Book. We know it from a famous Bollinger memo that said any UFOs involving national security will continue to go to the places they've always gone, wherever that is. So of course they'd have an interest in this. Of course they would be interested in unknown craft flying over sensitive military installations. However, that is not the extent of it at all. The NIDS guys, when they started their study in the 90s, when Robert Bigelow created it, I think in 1995, UFOs was a central focus. They actually had two missions. One was to figure out if we are alone in the universe, Are UFOs real? If so, where are they from? The other mission was to figure out, do we die? Is physical death the end, or does consciousness survive and go on? And are those two subjects related? Well, eventually, the UFO side of the equation sort of dominated the other one, and NIDS became primarily known for its UFO work. So that's why it was attracted to Skinwalker. For, as I said, for as long as humans had lived there, that place, for some reason, had been a hotbed of UFO activity. In the 1970s, a guy named Dr. Frank Salisbury from Utah State had gone into the region, collected the stories from Junior Hicks, whittled down to the best 400 or so witness cases, and wrote a book about it called the Utah UFO Display. The foreword to that book was written by Dr. J. Allen Hynek, and he thought it was a very legitimate book, and it was. So that established a sort of a baseline of information, academic information, to show this was real. It's been going on a long time, and many, or if not most, of the people who live there have seen them. Well, that sort of buttressed Robert Bigelow's interest in the property when he started looking into the ranch. He flew to the property. The rancher, we called him in Hunt for the Skinwalker, Tom Gorman. He was a solid citizen, college educated, an expert in Simmental cattle, hybrid cattle, just a smart guy, a big game hunter, fearless, and he wanted to hang on to his property. That was his dream property where he wanted to live for the rest of his life. His wife was the vice president of a bank in town, a solid citizen. Their two kids, rock solid, straight A students. But by the time the Bigelow arrived in 1996 to talk to them, they were a mess. They were ready to give up. They were literally sleeping on the floor in the same room at night for protection because they had been psychologically tortured by whatever it was. And this intelligence, this phenomena, had appeared in many guises. Yes, there were UFOs of every shape and size. They'd have these silent stealth fighter shaped things with Christmas lights around them that would hover over the property silently, shooting beams of light down on the ranch as if it was looking something. They had sombrero shaped craft that flew directly into Skinwalker Ranch, right into the mountain without causing any kind of an explosion or impact. They had gigantic black triangles that looked like B-1 or B-2 bombers that would be over the property. They had orbs of every shape and size. The first ones to show up were these little white ones that would flit around in the trees under intelligent control and would just kind of try to get their attention. They had these red ones about the size of a softball that seemed designed to create terror among their animals. They would stampede horses and cattle. In one instance, they drove his cattle off of a small cliff, caused a lot of injuries, and they didn't know what those were. The blue ones, a little bit larger than a softball, started appearing. They looked like they were up close. They looked like they were made out of glass. They had a blue swirling liquid inside of them. And these things were somehow able to touch the fight or flight fear center in the human brain and animals. They would drive animals crazy with terror. And it did the same thing to people. The rancher and his wife told of being up close to these things and were literally driven to their knees with fear, way beyond anything that should have been normal. So they encountered a number of different kinds of UFOs, and that's what attracted NIDS and Robert Bigelow. But as Bigelow and his team were to learn, there was so much more to it. Every bizarre range of activity you can imagine had happened there. Any kind of paranormal. There were Bigfoot sightings. There were other kinds of really interesting cryptid creatures that have never been reported at all, that harassed their livestock, injured their horses, vaporized a couple of their dogs, mutilated their cats, and then, of course, did terrible things to cattle as well. They lost something like 14 head of cattle before Bigelow had arrived there, and they were in danger of going under. They couldn't. Some of the cows would just walk out into a snowbank. You could see their tracks going out in the snow. Boom, they're gone. They disappear. Others were found all carved up, and the mutilations had occurred very next to the ranch house. Bright Sunday morning, one particular case of a calf. The rancher and his wife were out there at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday to tag the ears of these newborn calves. They tagged this one right by the ranch house, move on down in the same pasture, and within about 30 minutes or so, a dog that's with them draws their attention back to the first one they tagged, and they look back there and they see the mama. They don't see the calf, but they see the mama cow dragging her leg around in a circle, her eyes bulging out. She was clearly in distress and injured. We go back running over there to see what it is, and there's this calf that they had just tagged 30 to 40 minutes earlier, and it's completely stripped of flesh. No blood on the ground, no blood in the animal, no flesh left on the animal, just hide and bone. And one of the femurs had been ripped out and thrown over a couple of feet away, almost in a ritualistic way. They couldn't figure out how could this happen on a bright, quiet Sunday morning with the rancher, his wife, and a dog right there. They don't hear anything. They don't see anything. The NIDS guys brought trackers in. They looked for animal tracks. They looked for human tracks, vehicle tracks, never were able to solve it. Something had grabbed that calf, taken it somewhere, carved it up, and brought it back and dropped it there. And they sent samples to 2 different labs, independent pathology labs, and whatever had done it had used 2 different cutting instruments, a really heavy kind of a machete kind of thing to carve the flesh off of the bone, and then something like a scalpel, a much sharper and smaller instrument to carve it up. You know, they looked for, could this have been a predator of some kind? Well, there's no predator in the world, not even in Africa, that can eat 75 pounds of meat in 30 minutes and not be seen. It just, so this was...
Yeah, it's like a crazed puppet master of performing these, you know, horrendous acts, almost to create fear, because the effects on humans is not as dramatic and, you know, and immediate as this. But as we're going to cover in a bit, they were more subtle and insidious in many ways. George, I wanted to ask you, did you yourself work with or for AAWSAP or BASS in any role during that period between 2008 and 2010?
I did not. No, I was, you know, I didn't have a security clearance. I was asked to get a security clearance at one point so I could know more about what was going on. But I figured, look, I'd love to know more. I always figured I would get the information one way or another. And if I had signed up for security clearance, then I would really have limitations on what I would be able to report eventually. I always intended to report it one way or another when I had the green light. I mean, I appreciated being allowed to be a fly on the wall, which was essentially what was going on. I never actually heard the name AAWSAP until, well, we'll tell that story a little bit later, but until 2018, when I met with Dr. James Lakatsky. And I never even heard the name ATIP until it appeared in the New York Times story, and never knew what the difference was until sometime later. But no, I was not part of BASS, but I was sort of a sounding board for them once in a while on things. I was part of NIDS for about 4 months.
Yeah.
I worked as a consultant to give them ideas about what they could investigate, but that didn't last very long.
Did you manage to have sight of or get hold of any of the 109 AAWSAP reports or databases which were given to the DIA? I mean, presumably there was, you know, there's confidentiality and secrecy around that. Because in Appendix 1 of the book, you've got this huge list of reports and documents that were put together, you know, with the result of the program that went back to the Department of Intelligence. So, I mean, did you manage to...
how to say this? I am familiar with the contents. It's a lot of stuff. I mean, if you were to print out all those pages of the reports that they produced, it would be taller than me. It'd be over 6 feet tall,
right?
If stacked up. In addition, that was the stuff that the world has not seen yet. All that the world has seen is the titles, which we put in the book, the titles of the paper, and we did that so people can go after it, go find it. You know, file a FOIA. This is what it is. This is what it covered. Go get it. But some of those reports are hundreds of pages each. There's a report on Skinwalker Ranch that's gigantic. There was what they call a 10-month report. And I mention this only because others have now written about it. But there's a 10-month report that was a summary of all the investigations and the work and data that have been collected since the inception of BASS and AAWSAP. And it is massive. It shows you the scope of that program, which was way, way beyond just UFOs. I can tell you a little bit about what's in them in that Colin Keller has talked about it publicly, but they had what I think was probably the biggest UFO database in the world. There's more than 200,000 cases that they collected from government agencies, our governments, from foreign governments, from MUFON, from other UFO organizations and individuals who had their own private databases. They went to South America. They went engaged with European contacts and put all this stuff in a gigantic database. And then Jacques Vallée, famous Dr. Jacques Vallée, computer scientist, astrophysicist, designed the data warehouse. There was actually multiple different databases that were incorporated into this one giant facility. And I don't think there's probably anything else like it in the world. If AAWSAP had been allowed to continue, Dr. Vallée intended to add an AI, an artificial intelligence layer to it that would allow people to not only find individual cases, but to look for patterns in the data. But unfortunately, it was cut short. The AAWSAP program, I think, was probably the largest UFO program that ever existed that we know of. You think back to Project Blue Book, you can see those old photos of the Project Blue Book staff, and it's like 5 or 6 people.
Yeah,
that's not enough resources to get the job done. AAWSAP had 50 full-time employees at one point, a few more, as well as a couple of hundred subcontractors who are working for them within MUFON and other organizations. 50 times 5, it's a lot different, you know.
Yeah.
We can come back to that later when we discuss what the new program might look like, but it was gigantic, and certainly compared to ATIP. ATIP, which the world knows about because of the New York Times story and subsequent coverage by mainstream media, had 0 full-time employees, 0. They didn't have a $22 million budget. That money didn't go to ATIP, it went to AAWSAP to fund all those priorities and programs.
That's the impression I get from the book. I mean, the budget was 22 million is a lot to most people, but it's relatively modest in terms of defense spend. But the impression I get is that every single dollar was used extremely efficiently, and a huge amount of value was extracted from it. It sounded very professional, highly organized, very rigorous and serious. And that was the impression I got from your book, was just how well spent the money was for trying to uncover what goes beneath the superficiality of objects that are physical in the sky and whether or not they pose a threat. You mentioned liaising with foreign authorities or sources of information. I know, and you mentioned this in the book, but I knew about this in 93 and 96. You visited Russia, and I know that you met a prominent group of Russian ufologists and military personnel, and I think that included an Air Force colonel, if I'm right. Yeah. So, I mean, following those meetings, it says in the book that you basically provided translated documents to AAWSAP, and that it transpired that the Soviet military, which had a unit called 73790 from memory, was set up in 1991, and that it actually had fairly similar objectives to the now abandoned US UAP task force, which was, set out in the ODNI Pentagon report of June of this year, or the preliminary review, as it was called. And I just wondered, have you since received any significant updates as to where the Russians are in terms of their studies since 91?
The answer, sadly, is no. When I had the idea of going to Russia, it was, an interesting time. Glasnost, little bits and pieces of information were coming out of the former Soviet Union that we never thought we would see. I remember reading the New York Times, and they had a story about the Oswald file. KGB released this file about Oswald, and basically they were letting themselves off the hook. He wasn't our guy. We didn't kill JFK. But it occurred to me, with all the changes underway in the former USSR, maybe there was an opportunity to find out what they knew about UFOs. So I met this Russian physicist who had worked as a national security advisor to Boris Yeltsin. He'd been an advisor to the Russian parliament. He had helped teach Russian cosmonauts how to look for American nuclear submarines from space. He was dialed in. So he was in the US, and I met him through a US congressman who was a friend of mine. And I started talking to him about UFOs. And he said, I don't know anything about UFOs, never heard anything. We had a beer. And he says, wait a second, I got a friend at KGB who mentioned something about UFOs, that they had some documents there. And then a little while longer goes on. He says, I think their Academy of Sciences was studying this too. So I was working not for KLAS, but for a company called Altamira, trying to put together a series of UFO documentaries. We put him on the payroll. I asked him, can you find people who were in a position to know about UFOs, but have never talked about it publicly? And it took him 8 months to set this in motion, but he did. He found them very quietly.
It's amazing, George. You managed to set up your own spy agency through the news channel. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Over
Yes.
an American beer. Congrats.
Yes, several actually.
Okay.
We ended up going to Moscow in April of 1993 to meet with some of these people. I didn't know for sure how many of them might go on camera, but we talked them into not only going on camera, but in sharing information that they had on working on these programs. And Colonel Boris Sokolov was one. He was at the Ministry of Defense. He told us about this gigantic UFO study that the Russians had put out this order that applied to their entire military empire. Any UFO, any unknown ball of light, any unidentified craft in the sky, anything weird like that had to be investigated, and all that information funneled to one place. And that place was the desk of Colonel Sokolov. This study was gigantic. I don't think it can ever be duplicated again, but all that information went to Sokolov at his desk. Some of it was siphoned off, I think, by KGB before it got to him, but it was huge. And not tens of thousands, but certainly thousands of cases came in. All of the witnesses were military. All of them had gathered up information. I don't know how much physical evidence they had to go along with it. We did get photographs and videos, and it was tremendous. I mean, some of that information about the military study was still classified. And then we learned about another related program, the one you're mentioning, that was sort of an intelligence analysis program that followed the UFO study itself. And I met with some of those folks. And so I was able to get information that was very sensitive. And I figured out a way to get it out of there without getting thrown into gulag, and interviewed these scientists who'd worked in secret on UFOs and UFO cases for decades, but they couldn't speak about it publicly. And they came back to the US. Then in 1996, with a crew from the BBC, they wanted to go back. By that time, things changed. The people who had been very cooperative with me before were scared to death to speak to me. Most of them would not take my phone call, wouldn't return it, certainly wouldn't appear on camera. We did get some other people, high-ranking military officials, to share some things with us back then, but the country had changed. And, even when we were there in 93, Russians were marching in the street. There were a lot of pro-communist people who wanted to return to Russia's, era of dominance, and they wanted the USSR to be reconstituted. And it was a very tense time. There were military people on the rolling through the streets of Moscow. There was a giant protest at the Russian parliament. Boris Yeltsin seized control of all the broadcast airwaves. It was fantastic to be there, regardless of UFOs. But the country had changed in just that 3 years, and now it's changed even more. We'll never get that kind of access again, not as long as.
Well, that's the thing. The issue is US centric, and what comes out of the US compared to, say, Russia, China, India is huge, and you did very well just to get that far.
Well, I got a lot of that stuff translated when I came back, and I shared it with NIDS. And then when the OSAP happened, they said, "Can we have whatever else you've got and incorporate it in this database?" And I said, "Yeah." So they did a lot more translation and analysis, and they figured out the sort of the control system of that Russian study, and broke it down into a bureaucratic terms that I could never have understood. So they did a really great job of figuring out just how important and how widespread that program was. And it was gigantic. And the Russians told me they were trying to figure out the technology so they could gain an advantage over us, which is precisely what we're doing now.
Yeah. And they're highly innovative. Absolutely. Yeah. I just want to take you back to Skinwalker Ranch, if I may, George. In the book, you mentioned that you had several visits to the ranch, and in the previous book, and that, some of these stays were overnight, and that subsequent to these trips, you reported that your wife experienced multiple apparitions at home, and this included sightings of blue orbs from memory. I think they were outside of the window of your Las Vegas home. Are you comfortable sharing a little bit more about what you and your wife personally experienced, just so that people can get an idea?
Yeah, let me give you some background on this. We call it the Hitchhiker Effect in this book. And, there was some indications during the early NID study that whatever it is that's on the ranch doesn't stay on the ranch. It follows people home. And this was emphasized several times during the AAWSAP program. They sort of put the ranch on lockdown. I wasn't allowed to go there during the 3 years of the AAWSAP program. It's the longest I had gone without visiting the property. But they brought in a number of intelligence operatives from different branches of the service, experienced professionals. They were armed. They had combat training. They had been in combat. They weren't afraid of anything, but they were a little spooked about what they might face at the ranch. And of the 5 people who, actually 6, counting Jim Lukatsky, all 6 of the intelligence operatives who went to the ranch had an experience and then took it home with them. Something follows them home, like an attachment. One of the people who had that experience had dubbed it the Hitchhiker Effect, because it was like they had hitchhikers. So, for example, there were 3 intelligence agents who were on the property in the middle homestead, which is always where the most profound things seem to happen, walking at night. And they've got weapons, they've got dogs, and they feel the temperature drop about 25 or 30 degrees. It gets a chill factor, and they know something is odd here. And they see in front of them, it's like a black hole right in the pathway. It's already dark out there, really dark out in the country, but this is a black hole, nothing, no lights escaping this thing. And they froze there. It was communicating with them that they were not welcome. And so they departed. I mean, and then temperature goes back to normal. All 3 of those people took something home with them. The one guy that we call Axelrod in the book, he goes home and it's not him that's seeing something, it's his family members. His wife sees this wolf. It's a bipedal wolf, a wolf standing on 2 legs out in their yard, and it's leaning against a tree. She doesn't even say anything to her husband, I guess, but her kids then see this thing. Mom, there's a giant wolf out in the yard. This is on the East Coast of the US, far removed from Skinwalker. So then mom tells the husband about it. They go out and look at the tree where this thing had been standing, and it's got claw marks in the tree that have been dug in there. They watch this wolf bolt on down the street, kicking up leaves, and they didn't know what to make of it. They were kind of freaked out. There were a number of times in their house where they'd wake up at night and there's a giant dark figure leaning over their bed, looking at them. Its face right in their faces. They would hear heavy footsteps in their home, very much like what had happened at the ranch to the people who lived there. Then it starts spreading from the wife and the kids. It spreads to other families, the friends of the kids. They start having this activity in their home. They'd start seeing UFOs and cryptids and weird stuff. And it spreads, as Colin Kelleher said, almost like a virus. That happened to them. It is still going on for them. It's more than 10 years later, and it's still going on in their house. There was one intelligence operative, a woman. She's like a female James Bond, beautiful, had done a lot
Juliet
of
Witt, isn't
work.
it, from memory?
What's
Juliet,
that?
Juliet Witt?
Yes, Juliet Witt. We identify her in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon as Juliet Witt. Battle-tested, tough, not afraid of anything, highly trained in arms and self-defense, and smart intelligence operative. But she was a little apprehensive. They could tell she was a bit apprehensive about visiting the ranch. She was there with Colin Kelleher, walking again in the middle homestead, and they see this creature. And people have jokingly called it the dino beaver. I just think UFO people, as immature as they can be, they just like saying the word beaver. And this thing waddles along, and it's big and husky. It looks like a beaver, but with porcupine spikes on it. They tried to follow it, and it just kind of vanished. Juliet Witt, when she goes home, things hit the fan. As soon as she walks in, poltergeist type activity starts happening in her apartment that she shared with a roommate, I think a fiance. And they had an incident where a bottle of wine goes off a rack and flies across the room and smashes on the wall. They had the same kind of thing where there was entities being seen in the house. It went on and on and on, and the roommate left. They broke it off and left. She struggled to deal with it for a long time, as many people have. We don't know what the Hitchhiker Effect is. We don't understand why it happens, but it happened to all of those 6 people, the intelligence people. They all saw something. They all took something home, including Jim Lukatsky. And he won't speak about the things that happened to him at his home, but it did involve his wife. Robert Bigelow has publicly acknowledged that it happened to him. His wife in particular had some at first she kind of took them as, that this seems kind of harmless, but they did some things involving her that were very frightening. Colm Kelleher, it's happened to him, and it's happened to me. So I've been to the ranch a couple dozen times over the years. I have never seen anything that I'd consider paranormal or extraterrestrial at the property, much to my disappointment. I've tried everything I could. I would bring things home in the first 10 years when I was going to the property, rocks and bits of this and that, and see if it would follow me.
It's a provocation. Yeah.
As far as I knew, it wouldn't, but then it did. And then my wife had called me up. I was downstairs at this desk, and she was calling me up saying, hey, you got to get up here. She's in our courtyard looking at the stars, and these three orbs are zipping around out. I think it might be more than three, zipping around over our head. You got to come up and see it. And by the time I got there, they were gone. And that was kind of fun. And then it became not very fun because this thing came into our bedroom when I was not in the room. And I'm not going to go into detail about that, but it made its presence known in a very threatening way to her. Yeah. And so it's not something I'm going to be bringing any more rocks home from Skinwalker Ranch to try to encourage these events, but it's happened to everyone. We can't explain
that's it.
How do you investigate that?
It loses this sort of interesting and entertainment value when we cognitize and we read the reports that talk about, these blue orb effects of, say, localized cancer, autoimmune disease. That seemed to come up a lot in the book. The DIA's Jim Costigan's wife, I think she suffered from Hashimoto's, lupus and Raynaud's disease. I mean, this isn't funny. This is really serious and sad.
The effects tend to be, so we had one part of the AAWSAP study looked at medical effects, and there had already been some research being done, but had not been made public. And I think one of the documents that has been made public, one of the DIRD reports, looks at medical effects. There are a lot more cases that are pretty insidious and disturbing because, as you said, the autoimmune diseases that pop up after encountering these objects, they're real. The consequences for the people are real, and they're always so obscure and different. They affect different people in different ways, but coming close to these things is not good for human health. That's one of the conclusions we reach in the book.
That's right. Yeah. In fact, there was something I wanted to ask, a fly on the wall at the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies. And I know you were at the event, or the BICS essay event that recently happened, said that Robert mentioned that the book really scratches the surface of the true extent of the phenomena that was recorded. Are you able to give meaning to that or elaborate further on what he actually or may have meant by that statement, if it was said?
So, as I said, the reports that were written that go into excruciating detail about the nature of the beings that were encountered, the nature of the craft that were encountered, the strange phenomena that permeated people's lives. If you printed it all out, it'd be a gigantic pile of paper. All we're able to do is give some general sort of perceptions about what the data is in there. We couldn't get too specific. So we submitted the book to the Pentagon, and they put it through a process called DOPSR, this office that has to go through it. And it took 14 months for them to approve the text. And we had to make a lot of changes. We had to take a lot of names out, especially active duty personnel. Some of the incidents that we report that happened in there, we had to change the location and obscure the information. And so we went along with it because otherwise we can't publish it. I mean, both Dr. Lakatsky and Colm had signed NDA, the non-disclosure agreements. They were, I think Dr. Lakatsky still had a clearance when we started working on this. So we had to abide by what they said. So a lot of the information we had to take out. A lot of the cases that we shared were very sort of generic and left out a lot of details. If or when all that paperwork ever gets released, you'll see what I mean. But yeah, there's a gigantic pile of information there.
Because I mean, Dr. Lakatsky, Colm Kelleher, yourself, you were all very well aware of the previous in-depth investigations and, the witnesses yourselves frequently reporting this paranormal fallout or whatever we want to call it, and psychic effects too. I just wondered, plainly, what do you think is the source of this this phenomena after all these years, George, that you've been studying this and really immersed into the subject? Do you have a sort of a working hypothesis or a burning truth about what this origin is, what it is?
You know, I've been chasing the UFO thing for a long time, since 1987 when I first did my first UFO interviews. And in those days, the dominant paradigm in ufology was these are visitors from other planets, you know. And you know, for a couple of years, I operated under that assumption. I was a nuts and bolts saucer guy. I'm interested in flying saucers and government records, because that, as a reporter, that's something I get my head around. And then over time, the more you learn, the less you know. You know, Jacques Vallée and John Keel, their books and research had suggested this is far more complicated than visitors from other planets. And Vallée, in the first interview I ever did with him, he said, I'm going to be very disappointed if that's all it is people from other planets coming here, because it doesn't explain the depth and the length of human interaction with whatever this is. It's something else. So in the mid 90s, when I started learning about Skinwalker Ranch, that was kind of the final nail in the coffin for the extraterrestrial explanation. This is something else. It's far more complicated. You know, whatever this is, and it's probably more than one intelligence that we're talking about, it lives here. It lives here among us. Maybe it's always been here. You know, those alien editorials that we hear about from contactees over the years, where they tell us, hey, take care of your planet, knock it off with the nuclear weapons. It's not only their concern for us, it's their concern for themselves.
Yes.
So whether it is I think dimensional, some kind of a dimensional aspect to it, sort of makes sense. You look at the research going on now in consciousness, which, you know, I am involved with Bix, just as you know, an advisor to him. I'm reading the same books that Mr. Bigelow and Colin are reading to get a handle on it, to try to get my head around the survival of consciousness. But the Bix contest, the essay contest, had several really great articles written by people who are much bigger brained than I am, who would describe the nature of reality. You know, in the beginning of the first Skinwalker book, I said, reality isn't what it used to be. And that's what we're dealing with here is what happened at the ranch is kind of a learning curve. It was trying to tell us that all these things that we think are unrelated, UFOs, Bigfoot,
are related. Absolutely.
They're related. And it's up to us to figure it out. And the dimensional aspect, I think, kind of explains that. Consciousness research kind of explains that, is that humans evolved with these senses, sight and hearing and taste and smell and feel. Those were the senses we developed in order to survive. But the senses we did not develop are those would allow us to see what reality really looks like. 100%. Our understanding of reality, this desk, this computer screen, is far different from what it really is. And if we were able to see and detect and interact with reality as it is, we'd have a much different view of what our place of it is. And I think some intelligence is trying to bring us along and teach us what that is. Although, I don't know, I'm the glass is half empty kind of a guy, because I don't think we're getting the lesson in time to turn things around. You know? Yeah,
no, that's interesting, because you touched on it earlier, George. You said that the report to the DIA focused on the threat to human health, you know, due to these effects of the blue orbs specifically, and other phenomena. But you know, this is to be distinguished from the so-called threat to humanity, which implies, you know, malicious intent. Now, while the data from AAWSAP and BASS is obviously of concern, and you've personally experienced it at home, the book rightly mentions that there are cases and subjects who have been cured following a UAP encounter. And I think the book mentioned a Brazilian lady who had Chagas disease, something like that. So, you know, when we weigh up all the evidence and the data, do you perceive that the phenomenon is a threat or neutral to our existence as humans? Is it, you know, some form of kind of antithesis that we're using or unaware of that is trying to change us somehow?
I don't think it's an overt threat to us. If it had ill intent about us, it's demonstrated technology that could wipe us out, and there's nothing we could do about it. I think the harms that are documented in the book and were documented by OSAP are inadvertent. It's when people get too close to something they shouldn't get close to. I don't think it's intentional. There's the one case in the Skinwalkers at the Pentagon where these blue orbs enter the body of this one person, and disease happens. She wakes up, you know, it's while they're driving, goes into her body, and it causes all kinds of physical problems. But the individual has a dream where these aliens are leaning over and telling her, we're going to fix this. And I guess eventually they did. I think the harms that have happened and are documented are accidental, not on purpose, that if they wanted to hurt us, they could do it. But they are, in general, the ones that we know of are trying to tell us, take care of yourself, get your act together. They're concerned about us for ourselves, but also for the larger reality. Yeah, that's my intention. Of course, there's more than one intelligence. It's a good chance it's more than one, and not all of them have the same intentions. But as far as we know, they're at worst benign.
Yeah, I agree. Everything that I've studied and even personally experienced suggests that it's a form of ecosystem that's at play, or it's an extremely intelligent form of manifestation or manipulation that makes it appear that it's a different form of intelligence. But yeah, it's a moot point. I just wanted to sort of finish on the book by the epilogue, actually, which was in the final chapter of the book. And there's an extremely curious quote from Carlos Casteneda in there. And I'm just going to read it briefly. I'm just going to put it up on my screen. And it says, "They are the warriors of total freedom. They are such masters of awareness, stalking, and intent that they are not caught by death, like the rest of mortal men, but choose the moment and the way of their departure from this world. At that moment, they are consumed by a fire from within and vanish from the face of the earth, free as if they had never existed." And that's a very powerful quote. And I just wondered what that meant, that quote means to you, and why you think it's in the final chapter of the book, George.
I think the direction of the research, hopefully the direction of our understanding of these phenomena is heading toward consciousness, our understanding of consciousness, that we are never going to solve this mystery of UFOs by just looking at UFOs. You can't figure out the intent of what the intelligence behind these craft that we see in the sky. You're not going to figure out their intent just by tracking them on radar and figuring it out. That's why during the whole debate in the US Congress about whether we should have a new program or not, there was the people who want to focus only on flying saucers. Are they a threat to us? Can we duplicate the technology? Can we replicate these materials? Can we get an advantage over the Russians and the Chinese on the national security aspects, aviation safety? That's fine. If that's what you need to justify a new program, great. But you are never going to solve this just by looking at things flying around in the sky. That's like, the UFOs are like a way to get our attention. It's tinsel on the Christmas tree. It's lights, it's bright lights to get the kids to look at it. The real understanding comes from looking at the big picture and consciousness research. It's become kind of a buzzword in UFO circles and other scientific circles, even though we really don't understand what it is, or we really don't know what generates it. But it's like this other intelligence is trying to tell us, look at this, figure this out. And even though your senses can't see what's going on around you, if you can figure this out, you'll understand that the universe, reality, is so much bigger and more complicated and more wondrous than the tiny little slice of life that we see. So that's why that quote is in there. It's like, we need to think bigger about this. We need to understand the big picture and not just focus on this tiny little slice about UFOs.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to end it. And the government, or the US government, we can say, absolutely takes this consciousness side very seriously, and has run and investigated remote viewing studies. I'm thinking of projects Sunstreak. I think there's so many aspects that were hidden and now are coming into light, and it's not so funny anymore. And derision is becoming less and less common, thankfully, so that we can actually advance and get to the truth, whatever that really is. So yeah, thank you so much, George. That's been really wonderful to catch up and get into the book, which really covers all these aspects of the study of UAP, which traditionally was less accessible and less comfortable to deal with. So have you got any plans for the holiday season? We're now almost Christmas. I've completely lost track of time and space in this conversation. I just noticed the tree behind me, so I just thought I'd ask you, how are you, set for the new year and all that? And you got any?
I'm going to start my Christmas shopping as soon as this interview ends. That shows you where I am. It's my wife and I and some cats. So we're buttoned down here and trying to survive the latest variation of COVID and trying to keep ourselves safe. I would like to say this though about sort of where things are heading. Jonathan, we're very encouraged by Congress passing this legislation, it's paying attention to this for the first time. It's great that they've got somebody read our book in Senator Gillibrand's office to include provisions that would allow for the study of medical effects, psychological effects, because that will take them very much in an AAWSAP type direction as opposed to the very limited scope of ATIP. So we're encouraged by that, but there's great opportunities for mischief coming forward. Even if when the president signs this, creates a program, we don't know how it's going to be funded. We don't know how many people will be able to work on it. We don't know. We know that the Pentagon is not happy about it, that it's being shoved down their throat to some extent.
Exactly.
And that traditionally they have not wanted to share this information with us. So there's a great opportunity, I think, for them to classify things as national security cases so the public never gets to see it. There are all kinds of things that can happen that would prevent the public from knowing what's going on if they are so inclined, they meaning the military. So I hope that when this program becomes law, that people will continue to lobby for to give it enough resources to get the job done, and that we will push for transparency. The stuff that AAWSAP collected, this gigantic database, the giant stack of documents, there's nothing in there that the public should not be allowed to see. It should all be made public. Whether it will or not, I don't know. I mean, it would take a lot of scrubbing because there's very sensitive personal information in there, health information that would have to be taken out. Yes. There's nothing in there, I think, that would make us freak out or head for the hills. It is going to, a day will come when the general public, which is accustomed to the idea of UFOs from other planets visiting us, we've been conditioned for that. But we're not really conditioned, I think, to understand the realities of what was going on at Skinwalker, where there's an intelligence that's telling us it's always here. It's like Santa Claus. It knows when you're sleeping. It knows when you're awake. It can see you when you're in your bed, in your bathroom, throughout your life. It can enter our reality anytime it wants and leave. We can't see it unless it allows us to. I think people are going to have trouble with that. I think the general public, big chunks of it, will have trouble with getting their heads around that. But we need to start. We need to start. So I was proud to be able to work with these guys involved in the AAWSAP thing and to share that story. And I hope that level of involvement and investigation will continue in the future, so we can all get our heads around this and understand what's coming.
Yeah, that's well said, George. I mean, the truth is really limited to the ability to receive it. And, some decades ago, perhaps we weren't ready for this, but I think that we are now. And as you say, with the Gillibrand amendment to the Defense Authorization Act bill, it's really just creating a little window for democracy or Congress to look through. But unfortunately, it's at the Pentagon where, that will be showing what we can see through that window. That's the issue. So it's just the beginning. It's monumental, I should say, but it's constant lobbying, I think, that's going to increase the scope and input of what's actually seen through the window. So yes, completely agree with you. George, is there anything that we need to look out for in the new year that you'll be working on in particular, or are you just going to have a well-earned rest after a highly productive year as ever?
No, there's a lot to be done. I've already started working on a project that comes next, and actually two projects, and hopefully by the middle of the year, the public will be allowed to see it.
Okay, great. Well, I've got to mention that I'm co-guiding what's called the Immortal Light tour in Egypt between the 1st and the 14th of March, and it's really an esoteric, canter around Egypt to actually try and get to reveal some of these secrets of ancient Egypt and the links it has to the UAP issue with an amazing group of people, including a remote viewing instructor from the Monroe Institute. So that's something I'm really looking forward to. If you happen to be free and you're able to come, it would be a blessing to have you there. But I won't pressure you too much. No sales tactics.
That'd be awesome. But at least if I can't be there, I'd love to talk to you about it afterward. You can let the world know.
Oh, with great pleasure. Yeah, no, but it's a serious and sincere and a respectful tour, because I think that I've had experiences in Egypt before that I saw things that I would have rejected before. So it's an amazing place. Look, George, thank you so much. It's been absolutely wonderful speaking to you as always. You're a fountain of knowledge and experience, and thank you for everything you do and that you're going to continue to do for many more years to come.
Thanks. Great to be in touch with you. Merry Christmas to you and your family.
Yeah, Merry Christmas to you. We'll catch up soon.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.